Great. So hello, everyone, and welcome to the May edition of Real Places, CNU member webcasts. And this edition actually coincides with CNU's recent 2019 Freeways Without Futures report. And with cities, citizens, and transportation officials across the U.S. looking for alternatives to costly highway repairs and expansions, the 10 campaigns that we featured in the report will offer a roadmap to better health, equity, opportunity, and connectivity while reversing decades of decline and disinvestment. And I'm really excited today to welcome our two guests. We have with us Amy Stelly, artist, designer, and urban planner with the Claiborne Avenue Alliance in New Orleans, and Peter Sarver, convener for the Moving People Transportation Coalition. And Peter is with the Alliance of Communities Transforming Syracuse. So starting with Amy, if you could just tell us a little bit about your work and the communities that you work in and the types of things that you do related to freeway removal and the history of some of that.
Okay. Well, I'm Amy Stelly. Thank you for having me. And I live and work primarily in the Treme community, which is the neighborhood that received, unfortunately, I-10 back in the 60s. I grew up with I-10 and have never liked it, and vowed to get rid of it once I became an adult. So my work is definitely in the advocacy arena. I do speak out at city councils and write whenever I need to, just to really drive some of the points home and bring notice to our campaign.
Great. And I noticed that you had a really strong emphasis in your work on the social, economic, the place-based inequities relating to Claiborne Avenue and I-10. So I really encourage everyone to do some reading on some of the editorials that Amy has written on this subject. It's really inspiring work, and we applaud you and thank you for this work. So I'll turn it over to Peter now to talk a little bit about the work that you do as an ACTS convener. Tell us about that. What does that mean?
Okay, well, ACTS is the Alliance of Communities Transforming Syracuse. It's an interfaith social justice network. We have congregations spanning the whole range of faith communities, as well as secular groups that wanted to band together under our umbrella. And one of the issues that came up as our community began the discussion was the social injustices that had occurred when the powers that be decided to put an interstate and a viaduct through the center of the city, wiping out a vibrant neighborhood that was primarily African-American and Jewish, and essentially disrupted the whole ecology of our community. Gave people the means with the interstates to escape to the suburbs while leaving people, if you will, imprisoned really in the city because exclusionary zoning and other factors had prohibited people from out-migrating as well. I mean, people of low income kind of status. So given that as the backdrop and wanting to make sure that the errors that had occurred 50 years ago weren't going to be replicated, we began a process of having discussions with other community groups that we felt might have an interest in pursuing what would be the best possible alternative, not only from a technical engineering point of view, but more importantly, from a social equity point of view. And the rest is kind of history. Over the last 6 years, we've been engaged in a number of activities that have supported and finally have resulted in our New York State Department of Transportation choosing the option that we have been favoring. It's called the community grid, and it really removes the viaduct and creates a transportation system that is going to respect the integrity of the city, as well as provide people with safe means of transportation.
Thanks, Peter. So speaking from the perspective, both of you have been involved in this work, respectively I-10 and I-81 for quite some time. So looking at the perspective of some long enduring efforts where you've really been setting the pace on these initiatives to remove highways and working in communities and getting people mobilized around this important work, what advice do you have for other campaigners? Peter, how do you keep the fire going and deal with the setbacks and disappointments and pushback that you may receive in the process?
Well, I think our approach has been to gradually build up by identifying supporters and groups that shared our values. For instance, we engaged a leading union, 1199. We engaged AARP. We engaged a single-purpose group called Rethink 81, who were architects and urban planners, those types of folks, as well as other, what I would call politically progressive groups that, you know, understood why we needed to turn the tables on the power brokers that wanted to preserve their advantages to the maximum degree possible, because they organized with some big money behind them. Ours was an all-volunteer group, and so the struggle was cast in terms of a group called Save 81 that wanted to preserve at all costs the interstate going through the center of the city, and ours that wanted to return things to a more normal cityscape, I guess you'd call it. Part and parcel of that was creating community forums, designing them on a variety of topics at various locations in the community. So not only in city sites, but also taking it right out to the suburbs and saying, you know, these are the issues that we all need to be talking about. And if we can reach, not necessarily a consensus, but if we can reach a better understanding of our different viewpoints and then see where there might be some compromises that would lead to a better understanding of how one approach or another could benefit everybody. We think we did that. Of course, our opponents feel that they now have been disadvantaged, which is really absurd, but oh well.
So that's great. So the same question for Amy. What advice do you have for other campaigners who may be trying to spark these similar movements in their communities across the U.S.?
Right. Well, the first thing that I would suggest to anyone who wants to take on this kind of work is to try to remain fit and healthy, because it's really very stressful. And there are times, especially when it gets really tough, that it can take its toll on not only your body, but your mind. So I have found that keeping up with my health has really given me an advantage. It keeps me alert to begin with. I try very hard to listen to our opponents and hear them out, to make sure that their voices are heard as well as mine or ours, depending on what the conversation is. They may not always feel that way, but I do hear everything that they say. I would strongly suggest that you always speak the truth, even if it's painful. Know your facts and do your research. I found that research is an ongoing activity, and the more you read and learn, the better you are and the better you're able to field those questions. We have started to talk to groups that are outside of this neighborhood, but it's a little bit different for us because we're really an army of, I'd say, 2.5 people. And sometimes it's only me by my lonesome. So it's very, very difficult to reach everybody, but in time we will. So our strategy is to go for some of the bigger forums that are more citywide. For instance, we'll be presenting to the city council next week at one of their committee meetings. Those meetings are televised, so then a variety of people will begin to hear the story about Claiborne and the adverse impacts that it has on everybody's health, really. And of course, if you're a writer, I've gotten great response from writing op-eds that truthfully have taken the city to task about some very, very poor planning ideas. And my position is that Treme in particular has suffered from 80 years of horrible planning decisions, and we just don't need any more. So when you stay true to yourself and true to your position, that's difficult when it's just a few of you and you don't have a lot of people to bounce off of, because those who are less, what would I say? I don't want to use the word combative because I don't feel that I'm combative, but those who are a lot less inclined to really get into the fight will ask you to really, take it easy, don't be so bad. But when it comes to planning discussions, sometimes you have to take a hard line, because a planning flub is a planning flub, and people have to live with those poor outcomes for 50 or more years. So I think we have to really be careful, and sometimes you just have to gird your loins and be ready for the fight.
Great. And you mentioned that you've been involved in this movement, and you sort of had been really inspired to do something quite a long time ago. Amy, was there an aha moment when you really realized that this was the fight for you, or has this always been something that you absorbed in your environment and reacted to?
It's a little bit of both for me. I grew up right by one of the ramps to I-10. So when I leave my house or look out of my window every day, I-10, I hear the noise all day and most of the night, particularly on the weekend. So I grew up with this and I've never liked it. But my aha moment came when I met Bill Bora, who is the gentleman who was successful in getting the plans, for the French Quarter extension of I-10. They were stricken, really, after he and his friend took on the fight. And after hearing him tell his story, actually at a CNU Congress, I realized I can do this. So he and I began communicating, not a whole lot, but just enough for him to remain an inspiration. And I do have to say that we communicated about this in our own way up until he died, and he died about a year ago. So I feel like I'm carrying on work that he wished he would have been more successful at. That was one of his regrets, that the French Quarter plans were panned, but Treme was not, because there was no political will to help the African American community back in the 60s. So he really began taking up the mantle and at least discussing it. And then when I moved back to New Orleans and actually moved into the house where I grew up, I decided the fight has to continue. So the first thing I said when I came back home and went to a community was, that interstate will come down before I die. And I mean it.
I love it. And it's really interesting to think that this is such an intergenerational thing that carries on. People pass this type of initiative on to young people, and there's a lot of energy around young people getting involved in the movement, and they have a lot to learn from the history of where it's began, where it's at now, and the leaders that have sort of paved the inroads that are going to be necessary to make these changes that are going to help transform our cities. And reading your articles, it's been really interesting to think about, you talk about the French Quarter, and would they allow this in the French Quarter? Why would the city, the planning officials allow these types of things that you see in Treme, to happen? They wouldn't let it happen in the French Quarter, and that really speaks to the inequity that we see in our built environment. And I'm just really excited to hear from you on these types of topics. So, Peter, I also want to have this question for you. Was there an aha moment when you really, how did you get involved? Has this always been something that was on your radar, or when did you really in earnest begin to work on this?
Well, the irony, I guess, is that even though I've been involved for the past 6 years on this, before I stepped into it, I absolutely knew nothing about transportation other than the fact that I drove a car and, occasionally thought about things that might impact the quality of life for people from getting from one place to from the next. But I think what's important to say is that citizens that want to get involved can learn the essentials that are necessary to deal with critical issues facing our communities. It takes perseverance, it takes some reading, it takes conversations with other people. We had some divides that we had to overcome. There was a racial divide in that our group was primarily white, and African American groups were suspicious of who we were, and were we really part of the people who had not permitted the interests of those that lived in the affected communities to be a priority or not. Fortunately, the New York Civil Liberties Union moved into the arena, and now we're in active dialogue with them, and they're much more with African American staff, legal staff, able to pull people together into what I would think you'd want to say is some levels of trust that are helpful. The other divide that we had was a political one. It appeared as though the Democrats were on one side and the Republicans were on the other. But I think some of that has been diffused primarily because we elected a new independent mayor, and he was able to step forward with the kind of attitude that said, we believe the community grid is the best approach for our community, but we want to listen to what might be required in terms of mitigation. In other words, where there have been harms or where there will be harms to people once a decision is made. And so that kind of diffused some of the attitudes on the part of business leaders and other people that felt this was just a city suburban contest that couldn't get resolved. I think one of the most interesting divides for us was a generational one. My experience is that Gen X and millennials don't have much patience for meetings, and so we're using social media, and they're communicating in a way that, is way beyond my sense of how you go about your daily life. So they have added a dimension to our whole enterprise that's been very helpful. And, I have kids that are doing these kind of things, but unfortunately they live out of town. But I have good relations with the younger generation, and we have built upon their success, and I think they're building upon ours as well. So.
Yeah, that's fascinating that you mentioned this, this whole journey, and there is a lot of skepticism, among communities of color when people, white people come into the community, and there's a history of a betrayal of people coming in under the guise of, they're doing some renewal, and then there's a lot of injustice around that. So we hear that a lot among new urbanists, and I think it's really important for us as a movement to address those issues and start to speak intelligently about those issues.
Sure. And we have taken the leadership, by we I mean ACTS, in terms of raising the concept of white privilege as something that people in the white community, if you will, broadly speaking, need to grapple with, so that when they approach a situation, they are not so defensive in terms of wanting to or expecting people to just be welcomed and to not have any criticism pointed in their direction. So white privilege has got to go, and once those attitudes get reduced, then I think the dialogue will expand and improve.
Right. I wish it were that easy here, though.
Well,
Because
I'm not suggesting it's easy. It's a long-term kind of process. Yeah.
right, I understand that, and one thing that we're facing here is that Treme is undergoing a lot of gentrification, particularly post-Katrina. What people don't realize is that a lot of the property here was rental property, and those landlords sold, and when New Orleans became a piece of Hollywood South and folks came in with money from New York and California, they bought these very inexpensive rental properties that are stunningly, beautiful. And now we have, I'd like to say, a different complexion in the neighborhood. So that has been used by some of our political leaders as a battering ram to scare people who don't know any better, saying that if the interstate comes down, suddenly the whole neighborhood is going to be white. So it causes conflict among Black people who are talking to Black people too, because of what they've been told. So it's definitely, equity is something that I'm pushing, a conversation about equity. And I am consistently challenging the city and our leadership to talk about it now, not when the interstate comes down. I feel like that's going to be too late. But if we can begin to put things in place that halfway level the playing field, I won't say it'll be all the way leveled, then I think we'll be able to get more community buy-in and have fewer conversations that are racially driven. And that's a hard piece in New Orleans right now. It's really, really difficult because the whole city is undergoing a population change. So it clouds the vision sometime. And there are good points on both sides, I would like to say, but we definitely have to get past the inequity piece and at least have a discussion about it and try to put something in place that makes people feel like this is something that will benefit everyone. I think it will, but it takes more than me to convince the population that, we're gonna have an equitable situation once I-10 comes down, because it will come down.
And I think there are two aspects to the highways that are so integral to the follow through, one of which is with transportation.
Yes.
So part of our efforts have been to promote public transportation in various ways. And the second has to do with housing. And we are working to encourage mixed income housing when certain areas that are going to be affected are looking to see what is going to replace them. And so gentrification would be a terrible outcome for us. And I think we're making efforts to have the urban planners keep that in the forefront of their minds.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Peter and Amy. I think this actually ties really well into our next question for Amy, which, what are the elements that are crucial during the battle, and how do you anticipate and get ready for success when you look to do something like freeway removal?
Oh boy. Well, I always try to look forward. I try to keep the big picture in mind and anticipate questions or issues that I know are bubbling under the surface and will eventually come up. I try to stay ahead of the game, and that's part of, I think, the success with advocacy, that you have to be in front of the issue. You can't follow it. You have to lead it. So again, that goes back to making sure you understand what's being said and who says it, so that you can craft a discussion. I don't want to call it an argument. Craft a discussion so that the conversation moves forward. That's a lot easier said than done, particularly when the city and the political leaders are pushing what we would consider the wrong idea, like building a marketplace in a polluted environment that is not healthy. And we have said consistently that it is harmful to entrepreneurs. We started saying that 2 years ago, again, getting ahead and anticipating that kind of discussion. And it turns out that we have been correct. So you do need to be ahead of the issue, and then celebrate the successes that you do have. And we've had some small ones, seemingly small ones, but we celebrate them, but we don't get egotistical about them. It's just something that brings us to the next step. So for me in particular, this whole battle has been very organic. And I've had to listen to my intuition. And if that little voice is telling me something's up, then I will follow that thread and definitely do my research until I uncover it. And I have been correct every time. So I think if you have a good sense about the fight, you will intuitively understand what to do. And one thing you do need is a good sounding board, because living in your own head is not always a good thing, you know? So having people who will tell you, it sounds right, but, or having someone play devil's advocate definitely helps you anticipate what the discussion is going to be. And you can almost frame what kind of successes either you will have or you want to have. So I take it a little bit at a time. Especially since this is I almost feel like our campaign is in its infancy. I wish we were six years in and celebrating bigger successes, but at this point, we do have to take baby steps. But I can see us now starting to leap ahead and presenting to the City Council, particularly since they all opposed something that I said about this project a year and a half ago. This is actually a really good success for us, that they've gone from not listening to inviting us to speak. That's a huge thing. And also looking for partners who are good for you. For instance, we're partnering with LSU School of Public Health to actually bring data to what we know is happening to our bodies. You can see the poor social outcomes that the interstate has given us. It's not a gift, but actually putting some solid science behind that, I think has been a good strategy on our part. And I appreciate all of the work that LSU has done for the past year and change for free, so that's good.
That's remarkable. This is the first that I've heard of that model. That's remarkable. I mean, just the idea of bringing in the public health, doing data, having science-based research to show how these are affecting our communities, the well-being of people living in these neighborhoods, that could be a game changer. And, you know, CNU really hopes that we can continue to be a voice and assist and provide some, you know, Freeways Without Futures was 2019 was one of our most downloaded reports of all time. So people, please go, if you haven't already downloaded and read that report, it's a terrific read, and just support these campaigns any way you can in our movement. So that brings me to our last question, which well, actually, this is for both. And I think we can start with Peter. You know, what does success look like? How do we prepare for that now what moment in the post-highway age? You know, some freeways have been removed. Some of us are moving towards freeway removal rapidly. What is success going to be like when we get there?
Well, I think the important point that people need to recognize that this is not a short-term fix, and that there will be opportunities for victories along the way. We're into this 6 years. It is going to be another 6 years before everything is wrapped up. So whatever needs to happen, the continuing involvement of people and bringing new people in all the time is essential We're kind of on a high right now because the draft environmental impact statement is in our favor, but we can't let down our guard because we know that about a year from now, we will get the final decision. That's what I mean about pacing ourselves. This is not going to be something where we can just go, okay, well, we've done it, and we can go back to doing other things in our lives. So having relationships with the technical experts like the Department of Transportation people is critical. We've maintained those things all along so that we have a sense of not only their technical details, but also how their work is influenced by state political leaders like our Governor Cuomo, and the media as well. We can't just be passive and expect the media to seek us out. We've been very intentional in terms of having an ongoing dialogue directly with representatives of the media and putting messages into our newspaper and so forth.
Thanks, Peter. And same question for Amy. When I-10 comes down, what is that like for Treme? How will it look? What does success look like?
Well, hopefully Treme will be a lot better. And I think, again, success for us is going to be incremental as we move closer and closer toward actual removal. I think if we begin to see some of the social ills turn around, that will give people hope, because we are dealing with a huge opioid crisis, a lot of prostitution, and it all takes place under the interstate because it's dark and it's dirty under there. And also because of the way Interstate 10 has been designed over Claiborne, there are hiding places, which is bad. So you don't have natural surveillance. So I think when the interstate is removed, we will certainly feel refreshed, that we have our open space back. That's what people want more than anything else. But I think that we need to start now with telling them it won't look the way it was. Claiborne is a 100-foot median. It was beautiful in its day. It won't look like it was, but it can still be beautiful in a place for celebration and success. Right now, it's a dirty parking lot, and part of the argument that the city has put forward, and its cheerleaders for the marketplace, is that our life takes place under the interstate. Well, it really doesn't. In New Orleans, life takes place in the middle of the street, and the interstate provides the parking for the celebration that's in the middle of the street. So I think when people begin to see small changes, then those are the things that'll give us incremental success. But actually, the reestablishment of the grid would be a great success. Just opening up the space, I can envision it, but we need to share that vision with others, and that will be my next piece of writing, to actually put that vision forward, because people have asked, and I think it needs to be a community vision, but the conversation needs to start somewhere. So I think we're already receiving some little tidbits of success. Again, being invited to speak to the powers that be is a great one. And just having people respond to my op-eds, that's been very encouraging. It's widely shared in the community, which is a great thing. So hopefully we can keep influencing so that we won't get to the complete removal and say, now what's going to happen? We'll kind of already be there, understanding that it's really a work in progress, because it took 50 years for us to get here. It's going to take a number of years for us to get something that we really love, but we can get there. And I think sharing that vision and beginning a different conversation about what it could be is really where we need to go now. And that would be an immediate success for me.
Great. Thank you so much, Amy. That's really inspiring. Folks, please seek ways to get involved if you're in New Orleans with the Claiborne Avenue Alliance. and with Peter's work with the Alliance of Communities Transforming Syracuse. And please do check us out on cnu.org. Thanks again, Amy and Peter, for joining us on this month's webcast. It's been a very great look at some of these campaigns and what's going on across communities in the United States, and look forward to following your activities in your communities and bolstering those up amongst our movement.
Oh, thanks a lot.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
All right. Bye. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.